Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest Futures webinar. My name is Iman Koric, and I'm a junior scholar and education team member in the Bosnia and Herzegovina Futures Foundation. The topic of our today's webinar is legal risks and opportunities in the business world, and our guest speaker is Sanja Voloder, whom I will introduce briefly in the following minutes. Sanja Voloder is an experienced legal professional with a demonstrated track record of 14 years in the legal services industry. Sanja holds a unique background of practicing law in both the civil European law as well as the common Anglo-Saxon law jurisdictions. Sanja completed her undergraduate degree in the United Kingdom and holds a master's in law from the prestigious University of Cambridge. Throughout her work in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Sanja serviced major international clients and assisted their entry and establishment in the country. She has devoted her expertise and efforts to promoting the strengths of the business world in the country and region and has supported foreign investors in their further investments and stay in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Lately, she has focused on the development of her international practice as an English law solicitor by supporting renowned institutions in the financial services industry on their projects across Europe. Sanja, welcome. It is really a pleasure having you with us today.
Thank you so much, Iman. It's my absolute pleasure to be here today, and I'm happy to participate.
Thank you very much. So before we move on to anything else, I believe it would be beneficial for us to firstly define some specific terms. For example, generally, what do we mean when we say the business world?
Yes, okay. Well, actually, I would suggest that I right away start with my presentation because there is some information on the slides which I think is going to be useful for everyone following this webinar, if you agree, Iman.
That would be amazing, yes.
Okay. So again, thank you very much for that great introduction. As just a bit more information, I feel that I do hold the expertise and the skills to hopefully give you a little bit more information today about the business world, what are risks, what are legal risks and legal opportunities, as well as give you a little bit of an outlook for the future. I have prepared for today's webinar and the presentation on the pretext that I'm mainly talking to young future professionals, either currently studying in the sphere of technical sciences, so we're talking about IT, engineering, and etc. But hopefully, if somebody else is joining, I really also hope that this information is going to be useful. But of course, feel free to ask any questions throughout the webinar. It would be interesting to have it as an sort of interactive session, but of course, either at the end of it or, I remain at your disposal on LinkedIn to contact me if you need any further information. So as you can see on here, I have the agenda is something that's already been presented by Iman, and she gave a little bit of an introduction. So yes, so when we're talking about the business world, I feel that it's fairly obvious and sort of reasonable to most people. However, we're talking about interactions between organizations that do some type of commercial, industrial, or professional activity. As it is with business, the end aim is profit, and normally companies and organizations are organized from small to medium-sized entities to really large global corporations, something that's known as either conglomerates or multinational global companies. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have a relatively similar sort of system. Under our legislation, businesses are legal entities that are performing some type of production, sales, or service activities on the market, again, for the purpose of making a profit. Generally speaking, as you can see, the businesses can be, and often are, sort of organized in different types of industries and different types of sectors. So we have everything from manufacturing, construction, to different services, information services, human services, etc., etc. And I will come to and give you a little bit more examples, concrete examples in just a little bit. Legally speaking, and this is something that's very important from a legal perspective, companies and businesses can take different types of formats. So the most common one and the most often used by businesses is the limited liability company, so also known as LLC, or DOO, Društvo ograničene odgovornosti in Bosnian. Then we have joint stock companies. These are dioničarska društva ili akcionarska društva. That's the term used in Republika Srpska. And normally we're talking about large public companies, such as all of the elektroprivredas and companies such as those. It can also take a form of sole tradership, something that in Bosnian is called obrtnik ili obrt. So there are different forms, and all of them have their advantages and disadvantages, and obviously risks and opportunities that they carry. Yeah, so I wish to set out here a little bit more sort of a visual representation of what we are talking about when we're talking about the business world. As you can see, I've tried to diversely demonstrate a few companies from Bosnia and Herzegovina. Obviously, companies such as Amazon, Meta, and Apple being the, probably the biggest companies in the world and the most profitable ones, or they're first in some way or another in the world. I've also couldn't miss Bingo, which is our most profitable company in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and a couple of companies such as Ensoft, very prominent in the IT sector, and you can also see here Elektroprivreda, which is a public company, state-owned, and operates in the form of a joint stock company. So what do we have, and just to give you a little bit more concrete information as to what do we actually have in terms of business in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And of course, I just want to have a very small digression. If you see any typos and issues such as that, you must have a very good eye for detail. It shouldn't happen to a lawyer, but I really didn't have much time to properly look over this, so forgive me in advance. Anyway, so going back to this, so the business sectors in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So first we have the financial sector, and we're talking about all of your banks, insurance entities. So for an example, we're talking about Unicredit Bank, Raiffeisen Bank, and actually this is one of the most profitable and prominent sectors in Bosnia and Herzegovina, also one of the most stable ones. One of the most stable ones and one of the most liquid ones. What do I mean when I say liquid? That means that there's a lot of money basically flowing around. And the reason why it's flowing around is because all of us are saving our money within the financial services sector. Now, if we look at information and communication technology, this may be actually interesting for most of you. Most of you, we're talking about companies such as Telemach, we're talking about Ensoft, and all of these big IT companies, again, an extremely growing and extremely prominent and popular sector for Bosnia and Herzegovina. Very busy, very profitable, and really exporting services and products to the USA and the rest of the world. I think that a detail that I read in preparation for today was that they exported over 500 million of worth of, was it in Bosnian marks or euros, of services and products. So extremely lucrative and really growing. Then we have the public sector. So as I mentioned, this is your elektroprivredas, your telecoms. Well, actually, they have a telecom only in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Distribution and logistics, you want to be thinking about companies such as Atako here and Orbico as well. Oil and gas, so you might be thinking about Gazprom, for an example. Then we have retail. So this is basically, let's say, BM and JISK, fast-moving consumer goods. You want to be thinking about Coca-Cola. Media companies, so this is all of the media such as Clicks and One. Pharma sector, so this is basically Bosnalik and companies such as those. Accounting and audit, you might be thinking about, you might know about Revicon, which is actually a very useful tool for me in my line of work, or Deloitte. Hospitality and tourism, so you are probably thinking about Solazur or maybe Etnoselo Stanisic. Marketing and PR, so Altermedia, Mekan, Sarajevo, they may not be as prominent, but they stand behind all of the things that you basically see going on either on the TV or in social media. Business process outsourcing, again, an extremely interesting area and sector in Bosnia and Herzegovina, taking really a hold of a large piece of the sort of business market in our country. And this is companies such as Teleperformance and fashion and retail. So basically, we're talking about Zara and the rest of the fashion companies. So I hope that some more information was in there for you when you were, and hopefully concrete information, when you were thinking, okay, so what is it basically? What is the business world? What are businesses? What are we talking about here? So you can look at obviously the global markets. So we mentioned Apple, your Amazons of the world, or you can look at region. So for an example, we belong to the Balkans region or Southeastern Europe region. Or you can look at it in terms of the local markets, which is Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I gave you some examples there of the types of different types of companies, different types of sectors that you can sort of keep in your head when you're thinking about the business world in Bosnia. So I'm not sure if anyone wants to ask a question right now. Should we just continue with the risks and definitions?
I believe everything has been clear so far, but if we get some questions that are related to what you're currently speaking, we can make a pause just to answer them, or we can answer them at the end during the Q&A session. Okay,
sure. Okay, so moving on. Risks. Risk, everyone knows it's a bad thing, right? You probably people don't, well, depends, but most people don't like taking risk. And it's something that's got negative connotations. So I looked up for a definition of risk, and we're talking about a possibility that something adverse or negative will occur, resulting in loss. When we're talking about the business world, as I mentioned at the beginning, the aim is profit for the shareholders, meaning the owners of the company. Usually that's the sole aim. However, the world of business is changing, and companies will have a much larger, and already have a larger role to play. We'll mention that in a bit more detail a bit later. So nobody likes, and everyone is probably risk averse in the business world, because that has a potential of causing loss, and the businesses are not there for that purpose. If we're looking at legal risk, legal and risk really go really well together. This is basically, if you are a lawyer, your job is to minimize risk and the potential for losses. You're constantly thinking about risks and the legal issues that could cause possibilities for loss and liability. Now, losses, as I've mentioned, is something where you're basically losing money and you're not making money, which is not something that you want. Liability, on the other hand, can have many implications. It can result in loss, but it can also cause other consequences, which are generally speaking negative. And this is something, again, that's not wished for by businesses. So I've given a few examples here and obviously on the presentation, and this is in no way exhaustive. Risks and legal risks in particular are really, really specific to the type of company, to the circumstances, to a particular situation, a particular period in time. So when a lawyer says it depends, genuinely, it really depends on so many different factors. But anyway, let me just, for the sake of examples for everyone listening and attending this webinar, let me just give you a few examples. So it can be, a business can face a legal risk from not acting in accordance with the law. So that's kind of a basic, right? The laws are there to be complied with. There are many laws in the business world affecting companies, whether organized in one form or in another. Possible consequences of not acting in accordance with the law can be diverse. They can range from monetary fines, measures imposed on the company, and prohibitions. So our legislation, the legislation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, often provides for, which is a very drastic measure, but if you really mess it up sufficiently severely, then you can also have a prohibition to basically perform your business activities. And this is something, again, that no business wants. Even issues such as fines and certain other penalties can be undertaken, provided that it's a profitable business. But stopping with the business activities, it's really not something that's wished for. If we move on to the second point, not complying with your contractual obligations. So contracts and corporations and contractual arrangements are huge opportunities for businesses unless something goes wrong, which is why people contract, which is why people want to know what they are undertaking in their contracts and how they are going to be behaving now and how they're going to be behaving in the future. So if you undertake that for a certain product, you will pay 500 Bosnian marks, then that's something that's your obligation, and that's something that you should do within the deadline that's specified in that particular contract. If you do not do that, consequences follow, and you can have contractual penalties, which means that on top of that 500 Bosnian marks, you might have to pay another 100 or another 200 or 300. You can also have the risk of somebody suing you, so initiating a litigation proceedings, which is extremely costly and also time consuming in general, but in particular in Bosnia. And all of that would result in losses and actually your liability and an obligation to compensate both the opposing party, the court, etc., etc. So this is extremely expensive, and this is not a situation where business wants to find itself. The third example that I've set out here is unfair competing or unfair competition. So I mentioned, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 companies. Of course, they operate within their own markets and within their own sectors, but there is the basis of a fair market is everyone dealing on equal terms. So it's an equal playing ground, so to say, for everyone. So a situation where we would have Bingo and Consum, for an example, and this is just a really, really rough example, agreeing on prices, on saying Consum is going to increase the price of popcorn, whilst Bingo is going to reduce it, so we all go to Bingo. It's not something that is fair competition with everyone else in the retail sector in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And that's something that is governed and that is regulated by legislation falling under the competition law field. And again, for those types of behavior, which is unfair behavior, you could have fines issued and also prohibitions issued. So something, again, that will stop you from doing your business and basically should penalize you and deter you from acting in this way in the future. The final point that I mentioned here is actually default. One is discriminating, and that's from the employer. So all companies and usually businesses, if they are large enough, they normally employ people and individuals. And if you are discriminating, for an example, if a business states that they do not employ people above the age of 40, this is really not something that's favorable to the company in any way. A, it is against the law, and B, it holds a really significant reputational issue, or possible even cost. So for an example, I myself, although I'm under 40, I may not be interested and may be eligible to work with an employer that actually employs only people under 40, but I don't want to do that. Why would I? Because that's unfair. It's a matter of time when they will start discriminating against the fact that I have dark hair. So this is not something, this is regulated by the applicable regulations in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and of course worldwide even more. And if you are acting in this way, it really carries a lot of legal risk. Not acting in the best interests, this normally applies to the company management. They are the stewards of a company, they guard the company, they are responsible and obviously compensated for that. So acting in any way that's conflicting with the interests of the company, basically one way or another, acting in your own personal interest is also against the law and carries a lot of reputational risks, fines, and possibilities for loss. So if we look at legal opportunities, I hope that that gave you a little bit more information and examples, and I hope that was sort of relatively clear. When we're looking at opportunities, especially legal opportunities, but let's start with sort of the general definition. So what do we think about when we're thinking about the opportunities? So a good chance for advancement or progress. So that's kind of okay, right? Everyone wants that, especially businesses. And they're looking at opportunities. The best of businesses are constantly looking at opportunities. So when it comes to legal opportunities, this is not something that's very evident, that's very apparent to most people. But actually, in my practice, I really like to set the positives out. And actually, when people come for advice at certain points, it's just the opportunities are very difficult to be recognized. But I really, that's sort of my style of advising, and I try to do that with my clients. So it's a potential for gains from either, let's say, avoiding legal risks and the possible procedures. So this is all of the possible risks that we just discussed. And that's a huge cost-saving opportunity. So we're talking about a company that operates in accordance with the law, does not unfairly compete, and does not breach its contract. Okay, so there is a huge opportunity for saving costs and possible implications and consequences that nobody wants to be dealing with, especially businesses. Then, if you have a company that provides for good working conditions, equality, and takes care of employee rights and avoids discrimination behavior, you have a huge opportunity there for workforce interest increase. Now, we keep reading, and I'm sure a lot of you have faced this information, that a lot of employers are seeking for, and a lot of workforce, so people that can do certain jobs, are basically in huge lack in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we have to import workers, for example, on construction sites from Turkey, from China, etc. So this is something that's a huge advantage at the moment for certain types of businesses and certain business sectors. And of course, there is an advantage of reputational gain. If you have if you're dealing with your competitors and in the market in a fair, compliant, and correct way, everyone wants to do business with you. Or everyone that is looking at you and somebody else that's not behaving in a similar way, they'll rather do business with you if you have a compliant business, good corporate and governance structure. There are no dodgy things happening at the company. Then you are probably looking at at a good position for yourself as a good future partner to somebody else, which brings opportunities and, of course, new contracts, possibilities for contracts, and gain. So that was sort of that part. I would like to move on to the next section of today's webinar, which is sort of a little bit of information on where you can go, where you can go, what are your options when it comes to immersing yourself into the business sector in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I will touch up on very, very, very shortly on what is sort of available outside of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but I really will not go into a lot of details, considering that this is not something that you know, I don't want to promote that much. Iman, can I move on, or?
Yes, of course. We have a couple questions already regarding actually freelancing, so it would be good to answer them at the end.
Okay, good. Okay, so what are the options? You, for an example, are finishing your studies, or you are ready to basically either promote or produce or sell your service or sell your product into the Bosnian Herzegovinian market, or you have a skill that you want to monetize on. So what do we have in Bosnia? Again, just as a small disclaimer, and you have to understand that because I'm a lawyer, but this is not an exhaustive list, and I hope that it's basically food for thought. So you have the employment route, which is sort of the classical way. Then we have the option of establishing your own business. So whether you would want to freelance through a sole tradership or something that's called obrt in Bosnian, or do you actually want to establish a DOO, a limited liability company, which has its advantages and has its disadvantages. All of these options do, and I will set them out in a bit more detail shortly. And you can also go through one-off engagements on an ad hoc basis based on something that's called ugovor o djelu, or in English, that's a type of piecework agreement. Okay, so let's dig into these options. So I'll just explain very, very briefly before going in. So the employment route, we have on the legal side of things, very briefly, we have different types of employment laws depending on where your employer is. Obviously, Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have two different entities. Both of them have the employment laws. These laws are relatively in good shape. And if you are successful in your selection process, you enter into and conclude a fixed term or indefinite term employment contract. So depending on what's offered, usually it's fixed term for a certain period of time with trial work agreed if you are just starting or if you haven't had previous experience. So that's normally how it works. And obviously the emphasis here from the legal side of things and the things to watch out for is on the contract. So what your obligations are going to be. And that's something that you want to look at very, very carefully. I'll come to that in a second. The second option is establishing your own business. These two options that I've selected here, these two forms, limited liability companies are relatively more complex. You need to go through the registration procedure, which you might have heard is, it's not as flexible in Bosnia as it is in some Western European countries. The procedure is not done by one click within an hour. It's just how it works. You need to have your own business premises and have a management, which can be, of course, yourself. So, and you have something that's very specific, and you become a legal person. You hold legal capacity. What that means, actually, it's an advantage. What that means is that the company participates in business dealings and in the legal world on its own. So it's got its capacity, how I have my capacity as Sanja Voloder, and I am an individual, physically, it's a natural person acting within the society. The same happens with XYZ DO or XYZ limited liability company. It acts within its business and within its sector independently. This is so it takes on obligations and obviously it takes on profits. What is very important there is that a company shareholder, so yourselves as future potential business owners, are not liable for the obligations of that company, unless it is to the extent of your shareholding, which can be very little. I'll come to that in a second. If you would want to freelance via the option of a sole trader, which is not really, it's not freelancing as we see it in the Western world, but if you want to go through that option, it's a lot more flexible, it's easier to establish. However, the liability is unlimited. If your obert or a sole tradership owes any money to anybody, that means, for example, if I am behind that obert or the entity, I am personally liable for its obligations. Now, let me just transfer to the next slide to provide you with a little bit more information that you can read on from the slide. So I've selected, in terms of risks, I've selected two. And as I said, this is really dependent on the particular situation, what can happen and what cannot happen, and also how the business is being handled. I've selected a couple of things to watch out for. That's protection from liability and also protecting your works. And I'll come to the second point in a second. Liability, as we said when I was explaining legal risks, is really a huge thing. So if you were to be employed, your liability is relatively limited towards the sort of external business world, because you are normally behind the employer. However, you have your contractual obligations based in the employment contract, and also there are internal rules of each employer that you need to follow. So what you want to know very, very precisely what your obligations are within the employment contract, and you want to be certain that you can comply with those obligations. If there is anything that's unclear at the moment that you are entering into an employment contract, you should clarify that with your future employer. You also need to understand what happens in case of errors and in case of problems. You need to understand how the company approaches and deals with those issues. And this is where sort of company culture comes into play as well, and the approach that it has to its employees. There are legal provisions that basically state that employees can be liable for the damage caused to the employer if you have been, if you have made a mistake and caused the damage intentionally. So that means that's a really high standard. It really means that you needed to have been intentionally, purposefully wanting to create and make damage to the company. This is not really due behavior, and that's not something that's going to be tolerated. The second case is where it is due to gross negligence. So if you were really, not caring much about the work that you're doing and causing damage to the company resulting out of that. So that type of damage can be requested to be compensated by the employer. If you cause damage to a third party, the employer is going to be responsible and they will compensate that. But they can also come to you and request for compensation of damages. This is something that statutory provisions and legal provisions need to protect both sides, the employer and the employee. And this is a worst case scenario situation where you would probably at the end of the day not only be requested to compensate, but also fired. So you don't want to be in this situation, and this is not something that I would consider a reasonable future employee would do. So that's sort of on the employment side of things. If we're looking at, and I've touched on this a little bit earlier, if you were looking at limited liability company and sole tradership option. As I've set out here, limited liability companies, they are much more complex in comparison to sole tradership. You have a lot more cost involved there. So you fall under the tax regime, you fall under the regime for payment security contributions. If you have employees, you are responsible for your employees, and also performing your obligations towards anyone else, so based on the contract. You are you are a player within the business world, and you take on your liabilities and your obligations. Sole tradership, as I mentioned in the beginning, has a lot more flexibility, but as I said, the unlimited liability is something to really carefully to consider. Let me give you a practical example. If you are, let's say, providing some type of software programming services, okay, and you are capable of doing that on your own, you might think, okay, I don't want to establish a limited liability company because I immediately have to find business premises, etc. And I actually might be able to do this from home. So the option of setting up obert or sole tradership may be better, and it is more flexible, it's not that expensive, etc., etc. But you still have certain liabilities towards the state, so you need to pay your own taxes for yourself. And also, if in any case you do not perform under your contractual obligation towards, let's say, your client, then you can be personally liable for anything that they want you to compensate if you have made a mistake or if you did not perform on your obligations. So this is something which, as an individual, is fairly burdensome, and it can cost a lot. So unless you're really liquid, then you might want to consider all of these different types of options. In terms of ugovor o djelu or contractual engagement, this all depends on the contractual clauses. You want to watch out for what's in there, until when do you need to perform, until when you need to deliver a certain service or product, and you need to look out for your tax obligations. So normally they should be covered by the person engaging you, but this is often not the case, and you need to cover them yourself. So if you agreed on a compensation of, let's say, again, 500 Bosnian marks, that means that actually you will not be earning 500 Bosnian marks. It might be a lot less than that. It might be 300 net amount that you can keep in your pocket, and the rest you need to pay towards the state. So that's something to bear in mind. I'll touch up very quickly on the second, because I can see that time is running out and I would like you to ask questions. So protection of rights over works. As I said, I prepared all of this under the pretext of the fact that I'm probably talking to mostly students, software engineers, maybe some graphical designers. So I hope this is going to be relevant. What are works? We're talking about software, so different types of computer programs, and the legislation does say computer programs, so it's old-fashioned, the law is old, so that's how it says. We're talking about any type of audiovisual works or content, architectural, graphic design, scientific or technical presentations. So this is something that normally the default rule or the general rule is that if I create, for an example, I created this presentation belongs to me. All the rights and the contents in it belong to me. That's the default situation. However, if you create work within the employment process, or let's say based on engagement, then we have a different situations. I've set out here a little bit of a provision of the law. Any inventions or industrial design products created during work belong to the employer for a compensation that you are supposed to receive as an employee, unless otherwise is determined in the contract. The same applies in respect to software. So this is under a special regime, and all rights and ownership basically transfer to the employer or whoever engaged you to create a certain work. Generally speaking, and I'll just go back very quickly, works and this type of sort of intellectual work is protected by copyright law. That's something that we also have regulated in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now you can see here that I've noted unless otherwise determined by contract. So this means that it all depends what's in your contract. Your contract is the highest pinnacle of all of the rights, defining all of your rights and all of your obligations. Somebody is very persistent in calling me. Okay, so contractual provisions. There is a possibility to negotiate this, and this is something that you might be in long-term employment, or you might be, basically engaged and employed on software creation, where, the employer is like, you are employed to do that, I'm paying you for it, so all of the rights belong to me, which is something that's a standard. If you're working for a software company, everything that you are producing and everything that you are creating is part of the end product that the company is selling. So that's something that's normal. However, if, for example, you are engaged as an obert or a sole trader, or you are engaged based on a ugovor o djelu or peace work agreement, you might want to consider some negotiating points. And I've set out a few here. So, for example, you want to have you might not be able to negotiate the particular transfer of rights, but you might want to negotiate your compensation. So, for example, you'll say, okay, you get all of that, but I want higher compensation. Or you might want to limit a time period. So let's say, I'm not sure how this works with code because I'm not really an IT specialist, but let's say you have created a graphic design. You can limit the time period to which they are using it to just a certain time period, or even a territory. So if you create a website, you can specify, okay, you as my client, you can use the website limited to users accessing from the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I don't know whether this is actually possible, but I'm kind of thinking that it is. So this is something to also think about. If we're looking at the opportunities, I think I've set out some of the advantages. Limited liability companies, as I said, don't quote me on this, because hiding and establishing a company just to be able to transfer obligations on it and hide behind it is not something that, that's evasion of regulatory provisions, and the company should not be established for that purpose. However, the law and the incentive behind that is that the liability is limited, and the regulations provide for that option. So that's something definitely to consider. As I mentioned, sole tradership allows for flexibility. However, you have that issue with unlimited liability. And of course, for sort of beginners and those that are only starting to consider, being employed, and employment is something that's sort of the safest option. You may be exposed and gain experience and references on working for projects that the company is working on. And then later on, you can utilize all of the skills and expertise in selling your own product or further building up sort of on that. Very briefly, what is out there outside of Bosnia and Herzegovina in terms of everything that we've discussed today? I've had some experience of working abroad. To be honest with you, in my view, that's why I'm here. In my view, it's kind of same but different. As I've set out here, similar options are available. Of course, taking into considerations that apart from the fact that we are Bosnian and Herzegovinian citizens, that for most countries in Europe, we require work and residence permit. This is until we enter into the European Union. Employment option is probably the most probable one, because the immigration authorities require employees or require foreigners, such as us, to have regulated work and residence permit status, which means that normally you would need to be employed. The advantages are, we're talking about advanced economies, we're talking about innovative industries, we're talking about the next level of provision of services and selling of goods. I've set out here, of course, the opportunities are vast, especially for technical sciences, and the demand is extremely high, as you probably all know. The disadvantages to consider range from quality of life is a good thing, but that type of quality of life costs. So whether you would be sufficiently compensated, whether you can actually, live the same quality of life, because everything in advanced economies, everything is more expensive, especially with the current economic and financial conditions. You might want to think about cultural differences, and you might also think about, social things, such as whether you're going to be basically in a foreign country all by yourself, or, whether you can undertake all of the pressures that those much quicker, much more fast-paced environments can actually impose on you. So this is all something to consider. I mean, every option has its pros and cons, and it's a very individual assessment. So all in all, as you can see, there are, this is not even like sort of scratching the surface of it, but owning or managing a business or being employed within a business takes really a lot of considerations to sort of get your head around. Never, if anything is unclear, and if anything is kind of dodgy, and sometimes I say iffy, so it doesn't really smell, doesn't really, you know what I mean. Always ask, always read your contract, always, especially before you put your signature on anything, read it and then read it again. Never discount any type of unclarity, or if anybody is pushing you into basically doing something very quickly, it's often fishy. So it's probably, something that you need to just turn on 4 eyes and look at it really, really carefully. However, having said all of this, I really love this part of sort of our societies, the business world. And if you can really recognize the opportunities, the limits are really, well, there are no limits. And the best sort of businessmen and businesswomen do, which is why they are successful and liquid. To end on that note.
Thank you very much, Sanja. Many of our scholars already have their own established businesses. Some of them are looking into that. Some of them are freelancing. Many of us are looking into some employment options. So we are fortunately recording this whole session because many of them are either working or at university, so couldn't really participate tonight. But we do have a couple of questions if you have the time for us to answer them.
Yeah, sure. I'll try and answer them. If I don't know, then
okay. Just briefly. So the first question is, how are the legal institutions in Bosnia and Herzegovina following the trends of new growing industries regulating their business? So I believe this is regarding the new industries which weren't popular when certain laws were established, or something along the lines of that.
Yeah. They're well, I don't want to. I'm going to try very, very, very strongly not to criticize the institutions of Bosnia and Herzegovina and of our country. They are slowly, let's just say that they are very, very slowly following the trends. Some sectors are better. For an example, the financial services industry. These guys are really, and the authorities, they are doing a really good job. We are mostly in line with EU regulations, and actually the industry supports innovation within that sector. So for an example, that's why we have payments with phones, and you can access your money based from your phone, and there is a lot of flexibility there. In some other areas, for an example, if we're talking about things such as crypto assets, that's still although in Republika Srpska there is some advancement and they've started regulating it, people are still really doing it and if an investor asks me what's the situation, it's just still a really unregulated, I'm not going to say black market, but for a lawyer, it's still a very uncertain sort of situation. So without generalizing, I think that would be discussion for each particular industry. Maybe just a note with respect to the IT industry. The good thing is that there are many very specific regulations limiting this industry. And actually, on the one hand, it depends how you look at it. You can look at it from different sides. If there is no regulation, then there are no limitations, right? But this is all to be, of course, taken with a pinch of salt, and it depends on what the activities are of that specific company. So I hope that provides some.
Yes, I believe it does, definitely. As a future mechanical engineer, I see a burning topic in our industry. I mean, my personal future industry is, for example, the standards of safety of workers in the workspace, which is affecting both the employers and employees. And I don't believe is quite regulated in our country until now.
Not in any way up to a standard that it should be.
Yep, definitely. Okay, so the next question is, are there some specific legal risks we should be aware of while freelancing? And I believe that is the only one regarding freelancing. Yes.
So there's a huge conundrum regarding freelancing. And I would actually recommend that whoever asked this question, everyone else interested in freelancing, to look at market makers and to look at their guidebook that's available in English as well as in Bosnian, setting out the legal framework for initiating a business in Bosnia and Herzegovina. You will see that their comment there, and these guys did a lot of research, and it can't really be the general information I'm providing you today is probably not sufficient. But actually, freelancing as such is not recognized by regulations. Freelancing as it is, okay? So you might want to go under the sole tradership or obrtnik option. But as I've set out, the risks there is that you can't just enter into many different contracts without worrying, okay, if I make a mistake, or maybe you can get some insurance, but the main disadvantage is its sort of form and kind of costs almost similar like a company, but does not provide you with this safety of having a different legal capacity. I know that this is a legal construct. It's very difficult to explain, but sort of that's the main disadvantage. So the disadvantage is that freelancers as such are not regulated. So there is plenty of room for interpretation. And if you deal with authorities, they might say, or a tax authority, or let's say some type of inspection, which is not often the case, they might just say, no, you are just doing business of a company. You need to establish a company. So this, of course, and I don't even want to go into the details of differences between cantons in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. If you're sitting in Sarajevo, for example, there's a lot of people doing that type of work, and to be honest with you, they're just doing it from their homes. And I think that the tax regulations have now been regulated, and you need to pay certain obligations in that regard. So you might be able to just get away with that. If you are sitting somewhere else where the focus of the inspection and the authorities in another canton is towards freelancers, like it was a couple of years, well, not 5 years ago, until they regulated tax obligations of freelancers, then you might have a different interpretation saying you can't be sitting at home providing all of those commercial services, let's say selling your software code for those amounts of money without, setting up a business. as I say, a lack of regulation can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. And I really recommend, for more details, to look into that guidebook. I think it's available. You just Google Market Makers priručnik or guidebook for entering, or basically the next word should be just business in Bosnia, and you will be able to download that guidebook, which compares all of these options in a little bit more detail. And I really think it's a good piece of good document with most of the information, the numbers as well, how much this costs and that, etc. So I would recommend for everyone to give that a look.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We have only one question left, which is actually my personal question. So are there some industries or business sectors with higher legal risks than others that we should look out for?
That's a good question. That's a really, really good question. We have, this all depends, of course, what else would the lawyer say? But anyway, we have highly regulated sectors, right? So for an example, the financial services industry, if you want to be providing some type of open banking, or let's say some type of ancillary service to a bank, the process that you will have to go through as their supplier might be fairly burdensome. I'm just trying to think of a concrete situation. So it might be more burdensome than if you were providing, let's say, some freelancing for, and you know, that's just one example. The financial services sector is extremely regulated. The food sector, so everything that can have a possibility of majorly influencing either the stability of Bosnia and Herzegovina as a country or consumers. So if we're talking about the food sector, that's fairly regulated, considering that the production of food, the standards that needs to be complied with, are all extremely heavily regulated. The same applies for the financial services industry, pharmaceuticals as well. I think industries, actually, I don't really know all of them by heart, but oil and gas as well. So a lot of, like you mentioned yourself, Iman, safety at work issues and standards that need to be complied with. You would be surprised, although it seems to be that Bosnia in many ways seems to be messy. We have regulations and in place. It's just a matter of their implementation and their basically following in practice. So some sectors, such as the IT sector, such as this, like I mentioned, business performance outsourcing. So these all fall within the corporate services, so professional services. Well, even actually legal, maybe not legal advising. Legal advising is fairly regulated, but general consulting services. These guys, if you want to go into there, depending on your product and the service, you could be fairly it could be a smooth ride. So yeah, I mean, I just try to sort of give you some examples, but of course, looking into the regulations, and this is of course a helicopter view. It's not very detailed, but I do hope it gives you some information.
Yeah, it was definitely insightful. Thank you very much, Sanja. It was really a wonderful afternoon with you. I hope we will get the opportunity to listen to you sometime soon, once again on a similar topic. And I wish you all the best in your future career steps in life. Thank you very much.
To everyone else listening, and to yourself as well, good luck and full speed ahead. No other way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.